So, Paul, tell us about business commercialization and how you first got involved in this area.
So I was originally a lawyer by training, and I wasn't a very good lawyer in the respect that I had a habit of telling the truth, which I discovered was a career-limiting move in the law. And so I left law and went to Silicon Valley. Founded a startup here, raised money here, went to Silicon Valley, and for a while we were doing extremely well. And then basically the tech wreck happened, and I returned to New Zealand. And I had the option of going back into the law, or alternatively, I got talking with the Ice House, and Andy Hamilton was then the CEO, and he asked me if I could start up an incubator. So I said, sure, I'll set up an incubator for you. So I set up and ran the Ice House incubator, which is obviously all about commercialization and innovation, etc. And that was really the entree for me. So really an example of coming out of a traditional career, looking at getting involved in startups, and then from there getting dragged into the business of commercialization.
There's always been this view that New Zealand is very good at coming up with the ideas, but not good at commercializing. Is that broadly your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. New Zealanders are very good at coming up with ideas, and it's a particular type of idea as well. We don't tend to be quite so good at very deep, very technical research. Some exceptions to that, primary sector research, etc. But in terms of just generally innovative ideas out of the box thinking, we are very good at it. What we are not very good at all is in terms of making money from that. And there's numerous examples of where New Zealanders have come up with really world-changing ideas and which they've been unable to turn them into wealth. And that's something that we are really setting out to change.
Why does that happen? What do you find is the big mistake or the big failing to create that situation?
The biggest issue is lack of management capability. So if you think about what it takes to make an idea successful, you obviously start out with the idea, and then you need capital, and then you need management capability. And that management capability is both skills, but it's also experience and networks. And we just don't have a lot of that in the country at all. So if you went to Silicon Valley or Palo Alto or Boston, somewhere like that, there's no shortage of people who've done it before, who have made lots of money, who have great connections, who have great capability, lots of skills and expertise. Here, there are virtually nobody who's done it before and who have those kind of skills and experience and expertise. We're only just starting now to produce those people, the likes of Peter Mears and Rod Drury's, etc. And so with that absence of people, it just means there's just not as many people here who know what they're doing. And so as a consequence, even when you come up with a great idea, you're less able to put it into action and execute it.
Is part of the problem also that everybody thinks that everyone's great idea is a fantastic idea?
Yeah, there is also a tendency to think that the idea is everything. And reality is that in order of importance, if you think of those three things that you need capability, capital, and the idea. The least important is capital. By far the most important is capability. And the idea is somewhat important, but if you were ranking it in terms of relative proportion, you'd probably say 75% is capability, 15% is in the idea itself, and the balance is in capital.
On the website, you say 80% of businesses generally fail. That's the kind of accepted figure, 80 to 90%, depending on which metric you're talking about. But you say that shouldn't actually happen. So how do you go about changing that?
So it's about building capability, and there's two types of capability that you need to build. There's internal capability, so that's capability within the team itself, and that should be focused around your core focus, what you're really good at, the skill set of that business, and which the kind of things you don't want to outsource. And then so that's about finding what are the skill sets that you need and what are the skill sets that you lack, and identifying who have those skill sets and bringing them inside your business. And then there's external capability, and so those are things like your advisors, so your accountants, your lawyers, etc. And it's about finding those people who really understand what you're doing and can get alongside the business and act as partners to the business. And the issue there is as well, the service providers in New Zealand do a great job with traditional industries, so again, sort of agriculture or real estate or light manufacturing, those kind of issues. But when you start talking to law firms and accounting firms in New Zealand about, say, technology commercialization, oftentimes they've had very little actual experience of that. So if you're talking about how do you reduce business failure, it's about growing your internal skill sets as well as identifying really useful service providers who can get alongside the business and provide you in the skill sets that you don't have. Because sometimes it doesn't always make sense to have those skill sets within the business. And unfortunately, I always say that, New Zealanders love DIY, right? We DIY our bathrooms, we DIY our kitchens, we also DIY our businesses. And, the problem is that if, unless like if I try to DIY my bathroom, it's a disaster. That's why I bring in a plumber. Ditto, if you don't know what you're doing inside a business, oftentimes you can create a lot of damage. Sometimes it's better off going and getting a really good high quality advisor, bringing them into the business for a while, getting some good advice, and then you can put them back down again. And it's cheaper often to do that than trying to have that in-house. So it's about saying what skill sets are really important that I have to have in-house. What are the skill sets that can be external, but which I should engage with?
Do you think part of it is that we don't like to pay for it? We don't want to pay those kind of fees that are required. We think we can just get by with doing it ourselves.
Oh, look, absolutely, and and that's not surprising because when you're starting up a business, typically you're short of cash. The thing about it is that there's this old saying: nobody ever regrets paying for good advice, and we see it the whole time. That businesses they take decisions based upon things that they think they understand, and then things go horribly wrong. And it's extremely common. And I'll give you a good example. We saw a client recently that had they came to see us about 2 years ago, and they were looking to file a patent application. And we said, well, we think you should check this out before you go ahead and file it and determine if it's really going to be worthwhile. They said, no, we're fine. So they went off and they filed this patent application. They came back to see us, and some years later, and it was about to go through its national phase, which is when the patent gets really expensive. And they said, look, we'd like you to have a look at it now. And we had a look at it, and long story short, the way their patent attorney had drafted it was in an incredibly poor fashion, such that this application would now cost them about 5 or 6 times the amount it actually should. So you're talking about tens of thousands of dollars worth of additional expenditure that they didn't need to incur. Reality was, if they'd done that work 2 years ago, they wouldn't have had to incur that expenditure. But they were a bit penny wise and pound foolish, and that happens all the time. Yeah.
The issue for many businesses, though, is who do you trust to give you the good advice? Because everybody would claim the advice is good. So what are the telltale signs to look in that regard?
So for us, we always say, okay, well look at whether or not that organisation is truly independent. So for example, a patent attorney, their primary interest is in filing patents. That's what they do. The business is mostly about filing patents and patent insurance. They're not the person you should be seeking your IP strategy from. For the simple reason is it's a bit like going to a barber and saying, do I need a haircut? Of course you need a haircut, son. Sit down. And you find that in respect of lots of the professional service providers. So one of the key things to ask yourself is, are they truly independent? The person who's setting your strategy should not be the same person who's benefiting from it. So you don't go to your accountant and ask them for a whole series of financial advice in which they have an interest. So it's about looking behind the service provider's objectives to understand what their real interests are. Now, that's not to say they're all bad by any stretch of imagination. There's some great accountants, great lawyers, great patent attorneys out there. It's just about understanding what is the driver for their business and ensuring that there's a separation between their interests and yours.
Do you have situations where somebody does present themselves and you say, look, I really don't think you should go ahead with this idea?
That's, in fact, a very common outcome for us. We've always made it an absolute policy of this firm that we are direct and honest and to the point, because I've just seen so many individuals and inventors and small companies and even medium-sized companies spend huge sums of money developing technology, and it just goes nowhere. And you're far better off telling that company early that is the case, so that they have the opportunity to pull back, reconsider the situation, and then perhaps develop another idea with those resources instead of burning them on something that's not going to go anywhere. So yeah, absolutely. We've always said, look, if something's not going to work, or if it's our opinion, we'll tell them that. Now, that doesn't mean we're always absolutely 100% right. We could miss the Beatles. We could miss the next Google, but we see 10 to 15 new ideas a week. So we've got a pretty good nose now for what works and what doesn't. And at the very least, it can at least cause someone to stop and think and reevaluate what they're doing.
A typical scenario, somebody has a good idea, everybody tells them it's a great idea, so they run around and get 15 or 20 people to all tip 10 or 20 grand in, and then they've got a starting pot of capital. Often that's dangerous in its own right, isn't it? Because they're starting with the cash, and then invariably they just start burning through it. Is that also something you find?
Yeah, it is. A lot of companies come to us and they say that, you know, the biggest struggle that they have is raising capital, and we often say, well, it's actually not about the capital. If you're having trouble raising capital, it's more to do with the team. And you need to look at your idea or your team. If they have capital, yeah, there's a real tendency for it to burn a hole in your pocket. And what we always say is, before you start spending that money, which is, you know, money is difficult to earn, let's be careful about how we spend it. Let's sit down and analyze what you've really got here, because your idea and the intellectual property that sits underneath it is what is going to, like the foundation of a building. If that IP and that idea is really strong, then you've got a strong foundation on which to build the business itself. If, on the other hand, that is really weak, it's like having a weak foundation on the building. Sooner or later, you're going to have real major problems. And there's a tendency to just charge out and proceed ahead with the idea without sitting down, analysing the idea or the innovation or the intellectual property carefully. And once you've done that, then you've got a much stronger position to actually develop your whole commercialisation endeavour from.
The emphasis these days is put much more around market validation, and the fact that there's a whole process which goes to, you know, people like Rob Adams and so forth that, you know, talk a lot about this. Is process something that perhaps we're only beginning to really learn the importance of in New Zealand, you know, about now?
I think that we are starting to understand that there is a professional way to do this, and I think process is a big part of that professionalism. A lot of entrepreneurship, especially in New Zealand, is amateurish, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way. It's just simply coming back to what I talked about before, that we lack capability, we lack experience. So almost by definition, we're amateurs a lot of the time. And if you think about what an amateur does, they oftentimes are making it up as they go. They're trying to understand how things on the fly, etc. Whereas the way a professional approaches something is in a very structured and process-driven and professional manner. That doesn't mean they ignore bolts of insight, etc. from the side, but they try to do things in a way that's been done successfully before. And so that's what we do with our clients. We say, look, yep, you can do commercialization in a totally seat-of-the-pants, random way, and it might work. But I always say, I want an unfair competitive advantage. I want to tip the odds as much as I possibly can in my favor. The way you do that is by doing it in a way that's been done before and been proven to be successful. So you do it in a very professional, very structured fashion. So market validation is a key component of that. It's sitting down and saying, does anybody actually want this? And it seems obvious, but a lot of people don't do it. Ditto, how strong is this intellectual property? Because the reality is, if you've got a great product and it's successful and you have weak IP, it'll get copied straight away. And if you have a product that's a failure, it doesn't matter. Nobody's going to copy it. So in a reality, you end up in a catch-22. If you have a product that fails, nobody copies it. If you have a product that's a success, and you don't have strong IP protection, everybody copies it, which means the only place you can actually develop a strong, sustainable business over the long run is a great product with great IP. And very few companies understand that.
So thinking about IP, there's a temptation to sort of jump in and that's another area where you lose a lot of money very, very quickly. So what's the advice that you give businesses that have got a smart idea? How is the best approach in terms of protecting that intellectual property and the approach they should be taking?
So what we say is, once the technology is crystallized, that they should assess that intellectual property, or assess what the potential intellectual property they should get. So we call crystallization is, once you've got an idea that the technology is feasible, and secondly, once you've established very roughly that there's a value proposition and that there is a market for that technology, at that point stop and assess, am I likely to get strong intellectual property protection here? Because if you're not likely to get strong intellectual property protection, at that point you're going to be working uphill the whole time. That's the point in which you stop. It's before you file your patents, it's before you file your trademarks, etc. It's before you do your licensing, it's before all of those things. And assessing the intellectual property tells you a whole lot of very interesting things. One, it tells you, are you likely to get strong or weak IP? Two, are you infringing somebody else's intellectual property? And my rule of thumb there is, if you think it's really valuable and it's going to make you a whole lot of money, somebody else probably thought it was really valuable and was going to make them a whole lot of money. Therefore, it's more likely it's been done before, not less. And third, by assessing your IP, you're actually using the IP databases, which are publicly available databases, to get an idea of the technology development in that industry. Who's doing what they've done before, what they're working on, when they were working on it, what's the technology like, and gives you incredibly valuable market intelligence. In fact, we often use that market intelligence to feed back into the market validation studies so that companies have an idea of what's going on and who they can work with, collaborators, competitors, etc. So by analysing your IP, before you file, you get an idea of how strong is it going to be? Am I infringing somebody else? All this valuable market intelligence, and then you can make a positive decision about whether or not you should protect and how you should protect.
New Zealand has a pretty terrible track record of giving away a lot of IP and certainly not protecting it. Is that something that's changing from your standpoint?
I mean, ironically enough, New Zealand actually has extremely high filing rates for patents. We are, I think, about the 4th or 5th highest in the world per capita. We're about the same in terms of R&D spend per patent spend per R&D dollar spent, and also in per GDP. So we actually generate a lot of IP and we actually protect a lot of IP. The issue is in commercializing it and making money from it. So I see far more instances where companies have protected IP and failed to commercialize it than situations where they failed to protect and it got stolen. Right? The issue is not really so much about theft a lot of the time, it's about they failed to actually do something with it. And one of the great ways to get your IP stolen is to have an excellent idea and then fail to commercialize it, because somebody else will see the opportunity and will take it and get it out into the market. But if you've got your technology out there in the market, etc., people will buy from you. Because
this is often a failing, isn't it? People believe that once it's patented, then I'm protected. That's all I have to do.
Exactly, and that's only one part of the piece of the puzzle. Again, you know, patent attorneys love filing patents, but that's not what it's really about. It's about protecting IP. It's not about making money from IP, and that's what we focus with our clients on. Say, protection is one dimension of this. Really, the focus should be on making money from it, and that's really where the focus should be. So yes, New Zealand tends to lose a lot of, has in the past lost a lot of IP, but the issue is really about, it's because we haven't done things with it, we haven't commercialized it, and the focus and attention should be on how do you make money from this stuff rather than just protecting it.
How difficult is it to protect a patent? I mean, because then it's all about enforceability and making sure that you get the worth of it. Because I imagine this is another issue that a lot of people perhaps overvalue in terms of what they think their patents are actually worth.
Yes. In terms of enforceability, it's really interesting. You tend to find people fall into two camps with patents. Either those that absolutely love them and those that hate them. And one of the carrying cries of the people who say that they hate them is, well, you got to enforce this. How am I meant to enforce it? I'm a single inventor. Well, that's true. It is really expensive to enforce patents, and I'd be absolutely the first person to say that. But the thing is, there are other ways of enforcing it. For example, you can license it to a very large offshore company, and as part of the license deal, they have the obligation to enforce it, right? And so what we try and do a lot of the time with our clients is get them into a situation where they push the obligation for enforcement onto a much larger entity. So instead of them being the tiny little puny weakling trying to enforce it, they have an 800-pound gorilla enforcing their IP for them. And so it's about being smart like that. So it's not just about its value to you. IP's value is in part defined by the hands of whom it rests. So there's a saying that a patent is a sword, not a shield. And that sword can cut deeper or lighter depending upon who's wielding it. So a lot of the time you've got to look to say, who's actually wielding that patent? And they are the people who are going to do the enforcement. In the hands of an inventor based in a garage in New Zealand, won't do much damage. In the hands of a Fortune 100 company, could do enormous damage and therefore is a lot more valuable.
Licensing is a good option, often overlooked, isn't it? Because New Zealanders love to be in control of the thing. They want to do the whole thing. Do you think that's part of the problem as to why it's perhaps not used as readily as it is in New Zealand?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting. There's three basic ways to commercialize any piece of IP. You can sell the IP outright. You can license it, or you can do what we call deploy it, which is where you do one of sort of manufacture, market and distribute. And New Zealanders love to deploy. I think we have something in our genes that it gives us a feeling of exhilaration when we put things into containers and send them offshore, which I find completely ironic given the fact that we are so far from our markets. You would think that we would look at weightless exporting, which is sale and license. And so virtually all of our commercialization activity is done through turning out widgets and then providing them offshore. And so we've increasingly saying to our clients, well, why don't you look at licensing? Because licensing has a whole lot of advantages that are played in New Zealand, in the New Zealand condition. So, for example, licensing is extremely capital light. You need very little capital to do licensing. Distance is irrelevant because you're shipping IP, you're not shipping widgets. You can get mass distribution very rapidly by licensing to the right players. That requires fewer skill sets. You don't need anywhere near the size of infrastructure, etc. It's very high margin. So even though you make less revenue, the margin is virtually 95, 100% margin.
You could lock those cash flows in.
Exactly. So you get recurring revenues over time. So, we've worked with a client, for example, where they had a great form of packaging. And so we helped them to develop this packaging and to get it out there and commercialize it. We licensed it to 7 companies offshore. It's shipped 650 million units around the world now, and it generates 7-figure royalties every year. Now, those royalties are virtually 100% margin, so it's virtually 100% profit. It's the equivalent of having a $40 or $50 million business, throwing off huge profits, and yet it can be run with 2 or 3 people. And that's a really powerful business model. But when all you think of is putting things in containers, it doesn't naturally occur to people. Yeah.
But every so often you do come across one patent exception, and this was the company that you made an awful lot of money for, where they didn't actually realise the value of the patent that they had. Just tell us that story. Yeah,
so we were working with a company that developed a really amazing piece of software, and they tried to commercialise it, and they had a really good crack at it, but failed. They were very early, too early in fact. And so they had tried to commercialise it, they failed. Someone mothballed the patent and put it away, and that was a really smart decision. So about 10 years later, literally, the patent finally granted, and they came to see us and they said, what do you think of this? And we looked at it and went, well, this is incredible. This is very, very valuable. And so we helped them to sell that patent, and we sold it for them. It took about 4 months from woe to go. So within 4 months, we'd sold it for an 8-figure sum, so tens of millions of dollars. And that money was in their account within 4 months of seeing us. And for every dollar they'd put in, they got $45 back. So it was a great outcome for them.
Not necessarily the benchmark against which everybody should measure.
No, not at all. No, I can't. I wish I could say that everybody had a tens of millions of dollar patent sitting in their closet, but no, not the case.
But this also highlights this issue of regular patent audits or IP audits more generally, isn't it? Actually really understanding the value of your complete intellectual property, because while most companies have a very good understanding of their assets register, they perhaps overlook often the IP side.
Exactly. I always find it very ironic. If you go to most businesses, you can pull out a fixed asset register and it'll list things like desks and chairs and computers and monitors, etc. And then you say, well, where's your list of IP? And there is none. And yet the ironic thing is virtually all the statistics point in the same direction and say about 80% of the value of most companies is in intangibles, intellectual property. And so they're tracking $500 chairs and $200 desks, but they're not tracking what is oftentimes the most valuable asset of the company. And if you don't understand what you have, if you're not identifying it, you can't manage it. If you can't manage it, you can't make money from it. So yeah, it is extremely important to sit down and get that IP, independently assess and understand what's actually there, because once you know what's there, then you can take proactive steps to make money from it.
One other line I liked from your website, you talk about great ideas being ignored and safe ideas being promoted. Yeah. How do you manage that dilemma?
So it's a conundrum that occurs inside large companies, and the issue essentially becomes that one of the key roles that middle management inside these companies perform is in screening ideas. But the issue is there's a whole lot of incentives inside companies that cause those middle managers to make what are very rational decisions for them, but were actually not very good for innovation. So, for example, most middle managers, if they promote an idea that's wildly successful, they'll get a pat on the back snack and maybe a bar tab at the next drink session. But if they promote an idea that's wildly unsuccessful, it's a career limiting move. It can have huge ramifications for them. So naturally, therefore, they tend to promote ideas that are slightly innovative, a little bit out there, but mostly safe, and ignore ideas that are that have the potential to be highly disruptive and grow and be really successful. Ditto, most middle managers are really the best middle managers are rapidly promoted, and middle managers that are not so successful tend to stick around. So what that means is that if you're a middle manager, if you know you're going to get promoted in 2 or 3 years, there's no point promoting a big idea that has the potential to revolutionize the company, because those often take a while to implement, and it's not going to be implemented on your watch. Somebody else is going to get it. So therefore, those middle managers again tend to promote safe ideas that aren't going to go anywhere. Likewise, market research techniques. Market research techniques are notorious for finding safe incremental improvements to things and ignoring big disruptive changes. So hence, Henry Ford's admonition that if he'd listened to his customers, he just would have built a faster horse. They have the saying that developing a new innovation via market research is about the same thing as trying to drive by looking in the rear vision mirror. You just can't do it. And so what happens is that middle management tends to promote very safe, secure, incremental organic growth improvements, and ignore big, high potential improvements. And it's a real problem inside of large corporates, and the way you change it is by changing the way management needs to think about innovation, and that's got to come from the top.
So if we take all of these collective learnings in total and your global experience and we look around at what we are good at and what the lessons are that we should learn, what are the key takeouts that you think over the next 10 years to avoid burning the rate of capital that we have, that we should be really focusing on in order to make the innovation pipeline perhaps more successful than it has been in the past?
I think the very first one is about building capability, and that's a very broad statement, and it's about building capability right across the board throughout New Zealand. The second one, if you sort of drop down within that, is understanding IP better, and that means, for a start, assessing your intellectual property early in the piece. Assess it early and get it done by someone who's independent and objective. And so that really brings you on to the third thing, is don't let your IP strategy be defined by the person who's benefiting from it. In other words, don't go to your patent attorney and to ask them if you should file patents, because of course they're going to tell you to file patents, and that's nothing against them. It's just that's how they make their money. But your IP is your most valuable asset a lot of the time, especially if you're talking technology companies. It's definitely your most valuable asset, and so that means that you need to get that assessed and get independent and strategic advice around it. And I think that finally, I would talk about understanding that if you're struggling to raise capital, then that is oftentimes a read on the quality of the idea and the team. So that means you should, because a lot of companies come to us and they say, we can't raise capital. They say, okay, stop. Let's look at what the idea is about, and let's look at who's in the team, because most of the time the reason why you can't raise capital is inside there's one of those, the issue's actually inside that area. It's not lack of capital. If you have a great team with a great idea, raising capital is easy. We never have trouble raising capital because we've got a really great team here and we've got good ideas. Yeah.
And if you're not getting the capital, that's probably a signal in itself.
Exactly. I always say, look, if nobody wants to get in your boat, check the condition of your boat, right? There's probably a hole in the bottom, and patch up that hole first, get things right, and then go back around and do it again and get some good external advice, get some great people onto your team. You'll find it a whole lot easier at that point.
Paul, thanks very much.
No problem at all. It's my pleasure.